Okay, so today we're gonna go cigarless today. I just had one, and I'm kind of done with that for today. It's gonna be a crazy lit day with through these bars of our Casablanca imaging system. And ironically, Casablanca, which was set in a fictional city in I think I misquoted, it was northwest Africa. We're gonna talk about ancient Egypt. Kind of do a huge sentient scoop recap of what man typically talks about and thinks about when we talk about Egypt, because if you're like me, you grew up with a bunch of people whispering in your ear, aliens built the pyramids and da-da-da-da-da, and so you tend to get indoctrinated at a young age, and then you grow up and you realize, it's probably just a bunch of humans stacking rocks, and then you realize, well, wait a minute, that's amazing. What the hell? 3.5 or 2.5 million stones stacked up? Little weird, right? So I went down a pilgrimage in the ancient Egypt realm in my mid-20s, which lasted about 6 years or so. And it actually consequently ended with me having booked a trip to Cairo, and I hadn't quite paid for it yet, and 9/11 happens. And my agent called me and said, I'm going to have to recommend that you don't go. Because the German tourists were, attacked in their tourist bus by a bunch of guys. Just shit got weird, right? But more recently, in the last, say, 10 years, we've had some incredible books come out. Graham Hancock has shined some light on things. And then we have a couple documentaries, which I believe the best one I've seen is The Magic Tour, which is a series that I don't know where it aired. I think it was BBC or something, but it's on YouTube as well, which sort of rebrands a lot of the stuff that we think we're seeing. Now, that's a very loose, bizarre beginning, but let me say to you what I think is most important about a discussion about Egypt. And it goes something like this. Other than the Sumerians, let's just say, and perhaps cavemen, the Egyptians are where we really see the very first super evolved civilization that is engaging in not only cultural things, but architectural achievements, technical achievements that still blow our mind to this day. Now, the Sumerian texts, which are, again, they're mud tablets that have this, this writing on them. One, I think that can be forged incredibly. A lot of the ancient, Iliad and poems and stuff that they wrote, I think some of those are real, but I think that just because the carbon dating system for the history of Sumeria is based on something you can't carbon date, I think that, you could have revisionistic folks go in there and mess with stuff. Just a hunch based on everything else we've seen them do. But in Egypt, it's a little more difficult because things go back a long time. But we are sold a bill of goods about Egypt that is crazy. And it's important because, in my opinion, because it shows the lineage of the species of man. And unfortunately, the accomplishments of man typically subdivide into the tribalistic racial alliances, for instance, right? For instance, most Americans are not Egyptian. Most Americans are not African. Most Americans aren't Mayan, right? We have everything in this country. But I can definitely tell you that some of the competition that has developed over the millennia since these eras of a great accomplishment are always related to some racial boundary, and especially in the history of Great Britain. Like I've said on the show a couple times, the aristocrats, the big bankers that pay for wars and go and steal objects from various places in history, their key objective back in the day, and I'm sure there's at least a tiny modicum of this still exists today, but what they try to do is they try to steal the technology from the past and then reinvent it in their race and their culture to say, look what we did, For instance, longitude, latitude was something that wasn't really mastered until the 1800s, but was actually proven to be mastered around the time of Christ, if not before, if not an ice age before Christ, right? Because we have maps of Antarctica completely revealed from the ice before the ice actually formed down there. So the the South Pole is in a different location, and, there's just proof that man had it all figured out, which is a measurement of time and distance to figure out. I believe it's longitude that's the tough one. I could have that backwards. But when we have the history of Egypt, for some, folks that control our educational system, they really don't want sub-races in their mind, right? In their mind is a sub-race to have discovered things. And so they boil it up to a race that's acceptable, that's sort of an ally or their own race, and they say those are the people that design that stuff, right? And I'll give you an interesting example. If any of you had a very prideful Greek friend, you will undoubtedly hear this indoctrination that they invented mathematics because Pythagoras was a Greek person. He did this, he did that. And what's fascinating about it is that Egypt was done with their game officially for thousands of years before Greece ever became anything, right? The unofficial story is that Egypt probably had its stuff together for damn near 40,000 years before Greece was ever on the map. So what the Greek did was they came down and witnessed what had been going on with Egypt. I imagine because of proximity, they could have been educated by the mathematicians, but if nothing else, just observing greatness, they took it back home and proved it. The Parthenon has pyramids, Parthenon has pillars that are further apart than those pillars down in the Egyptian temples, which is a sign of evolution of architecture. But they've rewritten their history to say we invented all this stuff simply because we took the proper, surname of one of our scientists that really studied it well, and we put his name on it. Therefore, we designed it. And the truth of the matter is, we don't know who actually figured out a lot of that mathematics. Part of what I want to do is flatten this tribalism of our race did this, your race did that, and just simply level it down to the species of mankind. The species of mankind, whether or not we are dropped off by aliens, whether or not we evolved out of the trees, doesn't matter. We discovered these things, and you can witness the incredible creations of this stuff by just looking at videos of, Egypt and the Mayan history and various other places around the world. Machu Picchu, Tibetan temples. I mean, it's just phenomenal what we had figured out. Now, I want to go at the pyramids here briefly because we've talked about this on the normal show, and I think we did a pretty good job detailing it. But since this is a different audience and then we have a more focused format, I just wanted to go through this briefly because the pyramids for me have completely fascinated me, and I was definitely brought up with the idea that these are alien runways, that the plateau that was built for the pyramids to rest on was, supposedly like a runway for, spaceships, which I think is funny. The idea that as a child, I believed that they would actually land like an airplane, coming in for a landing. Just absurd, right? But so the pyramids are no longer what we have been sold that they are, in terms of them being a tomb for various pharaohs. The tombs in Egypt are actually extremely well architected, and they are very consistent. When you go to the Valley of the Kings, this is where everybody was buried back in the day, right? And they're very ceremonial. There is all their possessions in there, and there's passages on the wall about traveling over the river Styx and hunting and all this kind of stuff. And the pyramids lack any characteristic of a tomb. And then you'll hear, without evidence, you're going to hear that they're something different. And I think for my lifetime, I've actually heard that they were giant batteries, and or at least for the last 20 years or so. And I never had anyone explain it to me, so I heard that they were batteries. And I thought, how stupid is that, right? I mean, who's coming up with this stuff? Once I heard the science of it all, it made complete sense to me. And it goes something like this. Instead of approaching something with a predefined paradigm in your mind, this indoctrination that they took essentially, physicists and electrical engineers, and they re-examined the composition of the actual pyramids and pretty much have discovered that they most definitely were gigantic power generators. And that when Tesla created his big tower with the Tesla coil that was metabolizing energy, free energy out of the ether and out of the bowels of Earth. He copied exactly what they did, but used different materials. So let me break this down for you. The pyramids are built on top of a giant plateau, and it's said to be taller in the ground than the pyramids are up. And the pyramids are about 450 feet, the three great pyramids of Giza. And so that's huge. That's 45 stories roughly, right? But it's very specifically built such that the plateau has a catacomb of sort of hexagonal water patterns inside, and there was a natural water source that they used to fill it up. And the pyramids are built out of 3 different rocks, 2 different forms of limestone, and then what's called red granite. So the interior stones that we see today, because the outer coating has been stolen or taken off to probably disable this device, is made of a limestone that's very conductive, meaning it actually has a valence that can take electrons and move it around. The outer coating of limestone, which we can see from the top samples, actually is a very insulating limestone that doesn't conduct electricity. So it acts as an insulator, right, trapping the electricity that the internal rocks would collect inside. Now, in the corridors, you have something called red granite, which is sort of, they call it a liquid rock in terms of its electrical properties. It's extremely dense and is extremely stable in terms of its composition. But once put an electrical charge on it, you can actually direct it like a river. So you have these really interesting paths inside the pyramids, which if you've ever looked at them, I know that for at least a brief second in your mind, you went, what the F? Like, what's with these weird paths that are, these weird angles? Like, what was this thing? Because it certainly wasn't meant to be dwelled in, right? And again, because there's this sarcophagus-looking thing in the center chamber, people go to the tomb theory, even though it lacks principles of a tomb, any type of real worship inside this tomb. Okay. Underneath the plateau that the pyramid's built on top of, right, is something called an aqua ravine. And the aqua ravine is sort of a natural erosion of the rock down below that has water circulating through it. The electrical properties of all these things involved is that the aqua ravine actually gathers electricity and beams it up. The plateau accumulates it in the water supply, right? And the pyramid is beaming it down. Because of its shape, it's vectored to push it all down inside. Because of its insulating outer coating, conductive inner coating, and this liquefying hallway inside, you're going to be able to metabolize electrons into whatever you need them to be. Once the plateau is charged, any building built on the plateau or that wants to wire in and tap into the plateau can have electricity. Therefore, you have an ecosystem of sort of a power grid versus the buildings that are there, right? Extremely cool. And this is exactly what Tesla's tower did in 1917 that he started building. He built a gigantic tower with a huge steel ball on the top, built on top of a very dense foundation, right, with water in it. And then he had an aqua ravine underneath. He was simply recreating what the Egyptians had built their thing on. Now, what's really fascinating about it is that, Tesla came to America, I believe, in 1876, and immediately beelined it to Edison's place, fixing some machine on the way there and making a ton of cash. I don't know where he got his knowledge because a lot of the diagrams of the pyramids were yet to be published. Right around then, we had definitely started kind of cracking the pyramids, but it wasn't until really the 20th century, the 1900s, that we really got into the bowels of all this and started revealing things. So we have a couple anomalies. We have a guy from, I believe he's from Yugoslavia, Nikola Tesla, comes over with a massive amount of knowledge. And then we have the Coral Castle guy who also comes over, 1910, and starts building Coral Castle, saying he figured out how the Egyptians built the pyramids. Where did they get their knowledge? I mean, we had just cracked the hieroglyphs in the early 1800s in terms of understanding that it's a phonetic linear language, right? So it's very interesting to see that perhaps this whole thing of like a Mason type society on the back end had really never lost the knowledge and perhaps passed it down. And so these kids, I don't know how they get a hold of this information, get a hold of it and actually use it in their inventions. So very, very interesting. let's dial back a second before these pyramids are actually created, and let's go after some questions about the aliens building them, because I think that there's just a couple things we need to think about. Okay. So if an alien came here from another planet, all right, we can assume that their technology, unless there's a natural gate where they're just falling through some stargate and then popping out here, prehistoric man to prehistoric man, that they're not going to use limestone to build something. Like, why use an inferior product to build something, right? The way that the pyramids are said to generate electricity, and I know that you're probably going, well, wait a minute, dude, you just said conductive, non-conductive. How does this pyramid actually create electricity? Well, the way that it works is that the pyramid is attached to our planet. The planet rotates. The planet's screaming through the solar system. The solar system's going through the galaxy through the universe. And there's this stuff called ether, A-E-T-H-E-R, okay? Ether exists, but it was poo-pooed out of existence when physicists like Einstein came around because they simply couldn't figure out what the stuff was. It's an omnipresent wind that is blowing in all directions. And I've seen some of our viewers struggle with theories of ether because the experiments are assuming that ether comes in one sheer direction, and it doesn't work like that at all. Ether is coming in all directions. It is fully chaotic, and that is why these experiments fail when they start to look at it. You know, ether is gravity. The deprivation of ether causes negative pockets between two objects, right? If you have two objects close to each other, you know, there's a wind going around them. As soon as you bring them close together, you start developing a little negative pocket between these two objects, and that's why things pull together. That's what ether is. But ether also has a principle to stimulate the valence of a conductive material. For those of you who don't know electronics, when you have a wire going into an electronic device, you envision in your mind, you know, they always say electrons are like water. So the power company is giving you a molecule of water for every electron that you use, and it travels over the conductive material all the way up into your house until it's used inside whatever motor that you're having to consume it for. What's really going on is if you take two chainsaw blades and kind of touch them together, right? One blade would lock with the teeth of the other blade and start turning, so you have two chainsaw blades turning. Now, that's more like the way electricity works. It's a cogwheel system of them stimulating the valence of the wire that it's touching, and it stimulates all the way to your house, where it's actually rolling these outer electrons around your conductive material, fueling the engine. But all they're doing is stimulating the power at their source to stimulate all the valence along the way. Now, yes, technically speaking, some electrons jump from one valence to another, but then it gives up the same amount. So if it gives one away, it takes one away. So it's just pure balanced attrition. So what ends up happening with the ether is that the ether actually stimulates the valence inside of a conductive material. So it's just a stimulator that makes the stone actually become its own power source, and as all this conducts down. And of course, you have electromagnetic fields that stimulate other stuff, and you basically can harness power. That's how it works. All right. So don't think of it as water molecules coming through the hose, and that's not the way electricity actually behaves, right? But this notion that aliens actually built the pyramids is alluring, obviously, but there's no logic in runways, right? They're not going to land like some freaking biplane. If they're traveling, I'm sure they're going to be more of in a gravityless, anti-gravity sort of device is just going to land. Maybe they need a strip to park all their cars, or something like that. But if you look at the pyramids, I think the best thing to do, in the same way that we defend the moon mission because we don't want it to actually not be true that we didn't go, the pyramids are really there, and man really made them. And man was extremely brilliant, most likely, hundreds of thousands of years back. Man was absolutely brilliant. And I think that the history of man has been entirely injured due to some religions that want to suggest that man's only, 4,500 years old. If you talk to Christians, their Bible, they just got all confused when they look backwards because, there's too many virgin, births of messiahs and other religions prior to Christianity, and so they just basically try to cut it off at 4,500 BC and say that's it, That's when the world began, just severing all the rest of the connections with reality. But for those of us who can look back and acknowledge it, there's an interesting thing with the Egyptian history, and that if you were to ask your local professor when the Egyptians built the pyramids, you're going to most likely get an answer that's in the 3000 to 4000 BC era. But the reality is that those dates are based on a handwriting on the ceiling tile of the pharaoh's name in the Great Pyramid itself. That is the only evidence that those things were built around 3200 BC to 3800 BC, right? The truth of the matter is that they go back probably as far as the calendars that are imprinted inside some of the temples. There's a beautiful calendar of all of the pharaohs that have existed with month and year symbols up above, signifying how far back this actual calendar goes. And the calendar goes back about 36,000 years, 36,000 BC, with pharaohs named in every single one of the slots. And you can assume that there's probably pharaohs before that didn't contribute to this calendar. The Egyptians go back way, way back. And I think it's interesting that when we look at their paintings of themselves, right, they definitely are not Caucasian people, you know. And it is interesting that you have some of the paintings make them look very dark, and some of them look very olive skin. Some of them have sort of the larger African nose, and some of them have more of the Indian Caucasian nose, right? So they seem to have evolved over time in terms of the race that was there. But once you study the Egyptians, they lived very different lives than we lived in terms of the way that the pharaohs procreated. The pharaohs actually believed in incest as an imperative to preserve their bloodline. And then you have, you know, some deformities and skulls that they talk about, right, where they want to blame it on the inbreeding. But you had essentially brothers had to marry sisters, had to marry cousins, and it's just how they kept the bloodline pure. Something that the elite supposedly tried in Europe, and they created a bunch of crazy families that were all screwed up. And, you know, the way that incest obviously works is that if your family line has any ailments of any kind through impurities, I don't know, through crossbreeding or what have you, that's going to manifest every single time you procreate. Now, the theory goes is that if, say, the Egyptian pharaohs had no anomalies in their bloodline, they didn't have any cancer in their bloodline, no diabetes, nothing weird that was on a genetic, congenital level, they could be ancestrally procreating forever, and they wouldn't have any problems, right? Now, the crazy truth about the matter is that you do have tens of thousands of years of pharaohs that did this that didn't seem to create any crazy. So it's really strange. But I think that once we started crossbreeding, we created defects in our systems. And I think the defects work like this. When you crossbreed with different races, depending on how drastically different your races are, right, the challenge for the human genome is the following. It's just a matter of geometry. If you had someone that has a heart that's this big and someone has a heart that's this big, and you crossbreed them, you have geometry that's now going to struggle in the child. Some of the DNA wants to go large like daddy's heart, and some of it wants to go teeny tiny like mommy's heart, right? Or the opposite, depending on who's getting lucky, right? The reason why I think we have bad eyesight and need glasses more so today is because we've crossbred different geographical areas which have different size eyeballs. And so you're trying to create a precision device that's going to focus light through the lens down to the cornea, down to the retina, and when you have one that wants to be huge and one wants to be small, you're going to get sort of a football argument between the two, which is where you get astigmatisms and a lack of focus, right? So as you grow, it can get worse and worse and worse because, again, it's still the war never ends inside your body. Now, it doesn't matter if your earlobe's weird because it doesn't have any, acoustic issues in trying to focus sound in your ear. So it's only in certain organs that we actually notice this balancing issue. So eventually mankind will most likely balance out its crossbreeding. We'll be one gray race and we'll have perfect eyesight and we're going to be healthy. And at that weird moment in time, I guess you could sleep with your cousin. You're not going to come up with a big eyeball for a baby. But until then, hold off, right? The Magic Tour series on YouTube actually gets into some, first the electrical properties of the whole thing, and then they get into this knowledge about acoustics. about sound waves as they relate to healing the human body. And one of the guys who's involved with the documentary is a guy in his 80s who actually was raised in sort of a Masonic group that is more Egyptian-based, that knew the ancient history of Egypt. And so he was raised with the knowledge of the pyramids being a battery supply, that the plateau had electrical, honeycomb inside, and that it's built on an aqua ravine that then also charges it up. They just taught him that information when he was young, which is kind of cool. So us Caucasian people here in America, and so you guys in Europe, we can just immediately jump off his shoulders. And they actually took him inside the Great Pyramid, and they looked at the ceiling, which is this sort of stair-stepping, high-pitched ceiling. It's kind of the inverse, like you're looking at the bottom of a staircase, two staircases that come together. And they essentially said, well, why is this built the way it's built? Because it looks like it's just a mistake, And he sings a tone, and the tone gets, repeated in several other octaves instantaneously, and everyone just craps their pants on video. They're like, oh my God, this thing is a harmonic device. And he said, yeah, he goes, we healed ourselves with harmony, with sound waves. Sound waves will penetrate the human body and get rid of, invaders. And remember, from my other episodes, when you have an invader in your body, be it a virus or bacterial strand that's using your body to procreate, the atomic bonds of that invader are weaker than the atomic bonds of those entities that are supposed to be in your body. When your body is actually built to create it, it creates much stronger atomic bonds. So this idea that, as he explained it, you laid on an altar at a temple, which is more of a hospital than a religious institution, they would essentially suck energy from this plateau and just play a sound on your body, and your body would actually heal because it would rip apart through harmony, through literally sound waves, any of the invaders, and you just keep coming back for treatments until you're okay. It's really super cool, right? And for those of you that don't know, there's a difference between the Great Pyramid, which is the first big giant pyramid that they successfully created, and the copycats that are sitting next to it, right? The Giza Plateau has 3 giant pyramids. Now, you need to understand there's hundreds of pyramids all around Egypt, most of which are unreported, and some that are way, way larger than the ones at Giza. Same thing goes for the Mayan pyramids. There are Mayan pyramids that are the size of mountains, okay? And they've just hidden them, right? And there's pyramids in China that they won't acknowledge are pyramids, even though it's very evident it's a flat, rice paddy, and all of a sudden, boom, there's this crazy thing there, and they've got a bunch of treasures in the bottom, and they won't acknowledge it. I'm not quite sure why. I think it just throws off the alliance of the bullshit stories of the revised history of man. But the Great Pyramid was built different than the rest of the pyramids, and that is that they built a giant, plateau, like I say, on top of the plateau, they built a foundational set of stones, right, and got that perfectly level, which is phenomenal, right? But the interior rocks of the Great Pyramids are actually slanted inward at an angle. And so they're all sort of like a sled falling towards the center of the pyramid. And the pyramid is actually 4 different structures. All 4 corners are actually built separately, and they kind of geometrically stack towards the center. Then the outer rocks, are level. And so you actually have the illusion that it's just a bunch of rocks stacked level. But the truth of the matter is that the Great Pyramid actually has diagonal rocks inside, which has caused a lot of stress on some of the upper beams, and they've cracked over time, right? But these beams are 60-ton rocks, right? Now, there's a lot of questions about how man could have stacked up the rocks to build the pyramids. And, of course, you've seen the traditional stories about them, putting rocks on sleds, throwing water in front of the sled, and then, just constantly building this ramp of sand around the pyramid until they actually dragged everything up in the capstone, then pulled it all down and dusted everything off. I don't really have a strong belief either way. I think that what's interesting is that they talk about Egypt being extremely lush at the time that these pyramids were constructed, yet they want to tell you that these were dragged on sand. And so either you have lush or you have desert. One of the two would have to change. One of the stories would have to change to embrace the time that this was actually built, right? I think that observing the Coral Castle guy, you actually have some evidence that perhaps they had figured out how to harness energy and perhaps make a rock a lot lighter than it was before. And again, if you think about ether being blocked, as soon as something blocks ether, you actually have gravity on that object. If ether can pass through the object, then you have very little gravity because nothing is actually pushing on or prodding on it. It's almost like it's not there. If it was completely permeable, it would just kind of float around like a feather. So you have just a bunch of ideas that they could have actually had a meridian, an Earth meridian, which is if the interior of the Earth is plasma, which we believe it is, and then you had rips in the crust that is Earth, then you would have this huge output of energy on the line of this fault line, which would just be a natural defect in the surface of the Earth. If you had this happening, then you would be aware of electricity almost by design of existing, because you go outside and stuff would spark and have weird behaviors. If you had a well of electricity coming out of the Earth, then you could just play with it. It'd just be like a well of water. Well, look what we can do with water. I can divert it with my hand. I can drink it. I can make my hair wet. I can make a pool. But imagine you had the same access to electricity because of an earlier form of Earth where perhaps the crust is thinner, maybe it's just more active on a cycle that hasn't come back around again. But could simply be that when they diverted the electricity into a rock, maybe they were floating rocks. I don't mean floating, but maybe that there's rocks that aren't attached to something that are sitting on these fault lines, and perhaps that they were lighter to push, that when you got them off the fault line, electricity wasn't going through them. Who knows? But there seemed to be a lot of evidence that the Coral Castle guy had figured this out, and he was just using electricity to move rocks around. And I know that there's been debunking videos that say they've completely figured out the Coral Castle thing, and it's all pulleys and that kind of stuff. I think that there's a couple basic low-hanging fruit things that say that these theories that the Coral Castle guy was simply using pulleys as an only means of moving these rocks is fairly naive. In the photographs, you have a couple things. You have electrical box that's on top of his little tripod of wood, right? So he builds a tripod of wood, puts an electrical box at the top, runs wires down, and connects it to the rock. What the hell is that for if it's all pulleys, right? The other one is that he had rocks that were so massively heavy that there isn't a tripod of wood that's going to hold a 60-ton to 100-ton rock. It's never going to work. I don't give a shit your theories on pulleys. You need to have an equally powerful triangle of super dense materials to hold this rock up. You'd have to have, redwood trees, which are actually fairly brittle, but you'd have to have really thick trees holding this thing up to move them around. You can't just use, I think it was like 6x6 beams of wood holding up 60-ton rocks. And that's why when these crane operating companies are asked about Coral Castle and the Egyptian tombs, or I should say Egyptian pyramids, they say, look, lifting that rock is going to require bringing my biggest crane out, and we're going to have to counterbalance the shit out of it just to build that rock so it doesn't tip over. But again, you have these debunking articles that I'm not quite sure where they come from. I don't know if it's somebody that doesn't want us to figure it out. It's not like we're going to build pyramids again to build electricity. It's just not efficient to build a gigantic thing, and I'm sure that didn't create that much electricity even in its heyday, if that's indeed what it was, right? That's just a little bit about the pyramids, and this isn't going to be just obsessing on the pyramids. The other thing that you might not know about the Egyptian hieroglyphs, and I want to explain hieroglyphs to you guys because it might actually give you sort of the prod to get into this if you've ever been interested, because I just got interested in it strictly as a kid wanting to know. I just hate having, what looks like beautiful information in front of me and I can't translate it myself, right? It sucks, right? I want to know if somebody's lying. I want to know if this even makes any sense, So when I started getting into hieroglyphs, what you'll quickly learn is that there is iconic languages and there's phonetic languages. Now, the world survives on phonetic languages mainly, and now that application software is out there, you have some icons that we know as, the mouse and the finger and all this other kind of stuff, right? But the very first versions of written language in the Egyptian region of the world were iconic. It was a picture of a dog, it meant dog. A picture of a pharaoh, it meant pharaoh. But you'll understand that to create a language like that, you're talking about creating an image for every single thing that exists on Earth, and it starts to get to be pretty laborious, because what if someone drew a dog badly and you wouldn't know what the hell they were talking? Is it a cat? Is it a dog? I don't know. So over time, this evolved into what we call a phonetic language. And so you have in hieroglyphs for the most part, everything that you read is obviously it's you read into the face of the actual hieroglyph, and you sound it out. It's a bunch of letters that sound out the words that they spoke in ancient Arabic, and of course, we're not quite exactly sure all of the pronunciations of back in the day. Now, the interesting thing is that you have a profound absence of vowels, so most of it's just consonants all stretched together, although very quickly over time they did come up with some vowels, like the A being a bird, like an eagle sitting down, so we can get nice words like Ra and Ramsey. But you have an interesting regiment with the way that hieroglyphs are drawn, and I think it's actually pretty cool to this day that maybe we should consider it over time. But I think the intellect and the brilliance of an Egyptian person was way beyond ours, and I'll tell you why. What they had as a regiment was that beauty was the most important part about the Egyptian writing. You were to take a word that you need to speak, and you phonetically say it, right? So I might say cat. Now, in the Egyptian hieroglyphs, they'd have multiple letters that does a K sound, right? So in English language, which is based off of their alphabet, we have a C and we have a K, and both of them have the same sound. What the Egyptians would do when they drew hieroglyphs is they would actually say, this looks better with a K today, in association with the next word that's coming up, which, has its different symbols. And so what they end up doing is they pick the letters that look more aesthetically pleasing to the eye. And so every word that they spoke was based on a sound and not a regiment of you spelling it wrong, which I think is really interesting, right? It's just like, is it sound right? Well, then say it, right? Now, I'm going to get into the iconic linear change because I covered this a little bit, I think, in my evolution episode, but we're going to put it right in its place in this particular episode. Before I do that, they do continue to use icons inside of the Egyptian hieroglyphs. So there's something called a cartouche, and it's a circle with a line on one end, and you read towards the back of the line. It'll be the name of the king or the queen, and the very last symbol inside of a cartouche, if it's royalty, will be a picture of a woman or a man, depending on if it's a male or female royalty. And the crowns can actually change depending on how high in royalty that they are. And so you'll see a lot of people with necklaces that have cartouches on them. You can buy them with your name in them, right? Which is kind of cool. Now, recently they discovered by traveling west from the Giza Plateau and Giza Strip that they found another language that actually resembled ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs that are still in use to this day. And by interviewing this group of people, they said, yeah, we're the ancestors of them. And what you need to know is that not only do you have a phonetic sounding out sort of language like English, we also have icons, which you know. But he goes, there's also something that we use that you know of called acronyms. So abbreviations. So they actually have abbreviations for various words inside Egyptian hieroglyphs. And so I would imagine that that'd be very difficult to translate without knowing exactly what words that they're trying to abbreviate from. And again, because they can swap any consonant that sounds the same, it becomes geometrically more difficult to translate and to figure out, right, to decode. But there's something really interesting that happened between the iconic language era and the linear language era, and that is that the man's brain, and this comes from Marshall McLuhan's research out of the 20th century. If you haven't researched that guy, man, oh man, are you in for a heavy, thick ride, right? But he had figured out that when man thought in iconic ways, that, and you subtract all phonetics out of their mind, they've never thought phonetically, right? That you have this preponderance of here and now. So when you're iconic, you're constantly thinking in the here and now. You don't have, in your mind, the ability to really perceive the future. And so for a chess player, they would totally get what I'm saying, and that a bad chess player thinks about the here and now. What's on the board right now? A good chess player is taught to think out 2, 3, 4, 5, 10, 12 moves ahead. And that's how a computer finally beat a man in playing chess, because the computer was told to think up, 100 moves, 1,000 moves. And so eventually man lost. Now, what's interesting about that analogy with the chess program, Big Blue beating the Russian master, was that eventually the races, the species of man that actually developed phonetic communication, which just at the onset is a mind-blowing evolution of mankind to go into a phonetic sound-out thing, to realize that they broke down a single word into syllables, or syllables, as Michael Myers says, and then create an image for every single sound. So someone actually got super autistic or something, man, and figured this baby out and created this phonetic language. Well, once you started thinking phonetically, where you could read a sentence to reconstruct what you're saying, and it wasn't icons, right? You then developed linear thought. And what does that mean? That means that you have a past, a present, and a future as you read a book, as you read a page of text. And that simple evolution in man's mind made it possible for man to strategize against man and to say, look, we want that guy's stuff, and we're going to take it away from him. And when you construct a battle plan in the now, it's just bang heads. Whoever's bigger and stronger has the best weapon, who gets lucky wins. But once you have a phonetic, linear thought process, you can come up with pincer maneuvers, and you can plan, the sensei techniques of battle, because you can think ahead and you can see patterns, just like word patterns. You can see patterns that work. And so then you can say, just like Alexander the Great or Napoleon or any of these big battle guys, Genghis Khan, they figured out patterns of destroying societies and taking them over and stealing all their stuff. And so that was the gigantic transformation that happened before our very eyes with the phonetics of Egyptian hieroglyphs. Now, consequently, I think it's interesting that the Mayan history is almost completely undiscussed, and when you look at the beauty of and simplicity of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, you definitely see a primitive, beautiful nature of how they wrote and created symbols to signify things. But once you go over to the Mayan language and you start looking at their unbelievable, faces that really become most of their symbols and their animals that they integrate into their language, you're talking about an advancement that is equally mind-blowing to me, that they actually had this just almost comic book looking phonetic language that we're still translating to this day, And I think that one of the interesting things was that their hieroglyphs had elephants. At one point, there's an elephant-like symbol in there, and of course, there's no elephants currently in South America, so it's potential that they were from Africa and moved over there, or we had, somehow when the continents pulled apart due to expanding Earth, that species of animal was there, maybe till it was hunted away. Who knows, right? Definitely get into Mayan history if you want, but I'll tell you what, the amount of dead ends you're going to run into in the Mayan history is actually phenomenal. And I just think that it's, as the ruling class of the world gain control over history, that they gain control over our ability to access it. And so it's pretty easy to shut down history when it's not really discovered yet. You simply say, don't dig that up. Let's not cause any problems. The Chinese have the same thing. Don't dig it up, which is just sort of odd. When we do look underneath the hood, man, is it phenomenal what we find. Those armies of statues in China, they're just mind-blowingly cool, right? So for those of you that are interested in kind of figuring out when the pyramids were built, I sort of alluded to the fact that there's a temple that goes back 36,000 years. And, there's a lot of evidence that they had a complete grasp of the fact that the moon circles Earth and that the Earth circles the sun, because their two symbols for month and year were essentially what looks like, it's basically the month is a hollow circle with a line around it, and the year was a filled-up circle, which would be a bright sun with a circle around it. So those were the two symbols for month and year. So it seems like the Egyptians understood celestial bodies just as much as we do today. And I think that, again, we pat ourselves on the back that we're so intellectual that we wouldn't believe that they came from the stars. And I think that if you just take it at face value, the evidence is pretty 50-50 that these people came from the stars, which must mean that we come from there as well, right? Technically, we come from the stars. But the idea about when these pyramids were constructed, and especially the Sphinx, is interesting. You know, the Sphinx is rumored to have been a lion. It definitely has like a lion's paws and that sort of thing. And what they've done is Graham Hancock has associated this. So what they've done is they've said that the Sphinx had a lion's head, and when they take that assumption, okay, which I think is probably a fairly safe assumption, even though the pharaoh face looks like, you know, another long-lasting idea that they had actually been, you know, doing to say that our guy's the best. But once they take this idea that it had a lion's head and roll back time so that the Leo constellation is in the direction that this thing is facing, they come up with essentially 35,000 BC. Now, for me, that sounded interesting at first when I read the Graham Hancock's book, which is like The Secret of the Sphinx or something like that. But over time, it's kind of like, well, that's sort of a weird, loose connection between the two. For me, my suspicion about when the pyramids are actually built is based on the fact that when you look at all history about the Earth, and you ask questions about when Stonehenge was built, when the Mayan pyramids were built, Machu Picchu, the temples in Tibet, and all these other crazy things we find all over every continent that are unexplained, unowned by a particular culture. And again, the Stonehenge is almost completely unowned as well. You know, these druids say, oh, it was us, you know, and they just usurp the ownership of the Stonehenge. I'd say fuck off, you know, like you're just saying that that's you, so you can just say we have the right to go see Stonehenge, you don't, you know. It's just ridiculous, right? That there's any recorded history of 5,000 BC. But what you'll find is that there's this almost pocket of history where modern historians, run by these evil people, right, have pushed everything into this strip of nothing can be older than this. And it's a very compressed strip, right? If you take 4,500 BC to say 3,500 BC, they're going to say that most everything that was amazing was built in that situation. With Stonehenge, of course, because it's British, right? And British rewrites all history to make themselves the best. Stonehenge is 500 years older to 1,000 years older than even the pyramids, right? The British have to always be the fucking oldest, best, smartest people. Go fuck yourself, okay? Because these pyramids most likely existed way, way back, okay? The corrosion on rock itself suggests that these things are 39,000 BC or older, because the patina on a rock is actually something you can measure. The oxidization layers of rock is something we can take a look at. The Sphinx itself has a massive amount of water erosion at the bottom. When you roll the years back of what it takes to erode rock to that degree, you're way, way back, you know, tens of thousands of years before they say it was there. But you have to have national pride, right? So we have to spite the humanity of man and the true knowledge of the world to make sure that our national pride goes up, which is where you get this European domination of history. You know, there's a magical thing that was discovered in Egypt, which to this day doesn't really have the backstory to it that's very interesting. And this is the discovery of what we call the Rosetta Stone. The way the story goes is that Napoleon's general and a bunch of his men were digging in the desert in Egypt, which for me sounds a little bit strange, but whatever. And at one point, a pickaxe went down into the ground and nailed this rock. And it supposedly has the injury to this day of the pickaxe that hit the top part of the rock. And they pulled this rock up, and there's 3 different languages on this rock, one being hieroglyphs at the top. I think it was heretic and I can't remember the bottom one, but there's 3 different languages on it, all saying the same exact passage. And Napoleon's guy took it back to France, and they revered this rock as this amazing, you know, potentially we can translate hieroglyphs finally because we have the other 2 passages that we can understand. They say the exact same thing. But it took them forever to crack this thing. And consequently, the guy that cracked hieroglyphs as a phonetic language actually died in an attic and never got any credit for it. And the guy that's credited for it stole his stuff after fighting him for 20 years in public and saying it's an iconic language. He's full of shit that it's phonetic. Eventually, after the guy died, his paperwork was published. The guy took it because he was still alive and usurped the guy's success, just like Darwin took de Lamarck's evidence. Again, British stealing French knowledge sort of thing, right? But anyway, eventually Napoleon loses the war, and Britain grabs the Rosetta Stone and takes it to the British Museum downtown London, which I've actually had the privilege of going down and standing in front of this thing, which is now encased in like plexiglass. And there's one thing that was interesting. They finally cracked, hieroglyphs based on this rock. But for all intents and purposes, the rock appears to be true and real. But, you could actually have some crazy maniac, creating the whole thing from scratch. But I think it's real. Now, the rock says the following. It's a rock created by Ptolemy IV. And for those of you that don't know about the Ptolemies, when the Egyptian pharaohs ran their course and were completely taken over by Rome, there was a family called the Ptolemies, a white Roman family, right? They went down there and said, look, let us run Egypt, because this is a really intriguing place, and I just don't want you guys to come down and overthrow the place and tear it up. So let us take care of these people. And Caesar said, fine. And so the Ptolemies went at least 9 generations, with Cleopatra being the 9th successor to the family, right? But the third Ptolemy was assassinated. And one of his sons was the 4th and took up the reins and wrote these Rosetta Stones, right? What the Rosetta Stone says is, my father was assassinated. I'm going to get retribution. And here's the way the world runs now that my father's been assassinated, because I'm in charge. Now, the Rosetta Stone also says that the stone is being displayed in every single trading post up and down the Nile. So I've never heard a historian ever utter the words that I'm about to say here, which is that there should be a Rosetta Stone at every single trading post location somewhere in history, right? So we should be able to find uninjured, fully intact Rosetta Stones somewhere in Egypt. But we'd have to look for them and understand that that's what's out there. So something just very interesting to think about. But the way they translated, again, was that they had 2 languages down below saying the same exact thing. And so they essentially went up to the top, which was very injured, and started translating words. And because they didn't have the very tippy top, they couldn't do a very easy correlation between what might have been phonetic words. But eventually this guy cracked it, and we got rolling with it. Now, once it was cracked, the interesting thing was that we started learning that they had amazing poetry, that a lot of the parables in the Bible, like for instance, the prodigal son parable is actually a poem written in hieroglyphs 3,000 or 4,000 years at a minimum before Christ ever existed. And Christ never was rumored to have written those, he just used them. But it's very interesting how wise you had the Egyptians and how artistic and cultural they were, right? But there's something very interesting about the pyramids, in that when we think about the pyramids, we think about stacking rocks, and, we don't really account for the fact that they had precision in cutting these rocks. The way that it's romanticized up today is that they used other rocks and kept, tapping on them until they tapped away all of the rocks to the point where it's smooth to the degree of 5/100th of an inch, right? You got rocks that are 40 feet long that don't deviate more than 5/100th of an inch all the way down. And supposedly it's guys tapping rocks, right? Which is just utterly absurd. They have these unbelievable obelisks. And if you're like me, you looked at obelisks and you just kind of go, yeah, whatever. It's one of those Washington Monument things. But what you need to understand about an obelisk is, if you ever were to try to build one, within seconds, your mind would be utterly blown at how complicated an obelisk is. An obelisk, if the camera is pointing straight down the tip of this thing, right, you have a square at the base, and you have a tapered square that's smaller at the top, and then you have a point in the center of that last square. And so you're building an object, which, some of these things are criminy. I mean, I think they're like 10 stories high, if not longer, that taper from one square to the other, absolutely precise and perfect. There is no twisty-turny defects in these obelisks. So to build an obelisk, you are guaranteeing that the precision that it took to build the pyramids is damn near the precision it would take to build one obelisk. And the obelisk is supposed to be the phallus of Nimrod, who was slaughtered, and his wife. There's 2 ways to tell. There's the Sumerian thing, which is supposedly Queen Ishtar, or Queen Semiramis, is his wife, and she finds her husband all chopped up, tries to put him back together like the egg dude, and can't find his dick. And so then he ascends to the heavens, and then with the sun's rays, he impregnates Isis, I'm gonna do Isis Horus next, but he impregnates Queen Semiramis, and she has this virgin birth of Tammuz, which is sort of the story of Christ way, way before anyone else had done it. And the Egyptians retold it such it was Horus and Isis having another baby. And there's hieroglyphs of the virgin birth, that it will predate Christ by, millennia. And so we have to assume that this is a story arc that's been going on for a very, very long time, right? The reason why I mention the obelisk is that they actually have proof now that these Egyptians actually had at least circular saws. And it seems like it makes sense, except what do you build a saw blade out of? You can't build it out of the same exact stone that you're cutting with, because it would break. So we're not exactly sure what the heck they built these things out of. None of the machines have survived, but rocks are strewn all over Egypt that actually have sort of circular saw cut marks all through them. And they're just like little rubble pieces laying around, right? But they're ancient, right? They're going back, again, tens of thousands of years with this precision. So these guys were way, way more advanced. I think that the species that is the Egyptians that you behold in hieroglyphs, I'm not sure it exists anymore in the region because of the, just crossbreeding over the millennia. So I think that we have recessed in our European genes, especially, this beautiful connection with the past. And I think that, if you've ever, it's interesting. So if you're looking at your career and you have a drive for your career, what's actually interesting is that you tend to have a certain predisposition for something that you like. You either like numbers, or you're an architect, or you're a painter. You have certain pushes, right? Well, if you look at all the ancient Egyptian stuff that's created, you obviously see that beautiful thrust of their culture that must exist because it has to exist, sort of thing, right? One of the most amazing things that you can find on ancient Egypt is the precision in the huge statues that they created, right? One of the most, I'm saying the word mind-blowing a lot, but it just is, where they took this face of a pharaoh that was made into a gigantic, like 10-foot by 12-foot head. It was based, I think it was even attached to a body. But they took it into a computer, took one half of the face and feathered it over, duplicated it, and mirrored it on top of the right side of the face. And then they varied the opacity, right? So it was a little bit transparent, so you could see where the eye socket was that was over here. And the precision of the both sides matching is identical. It's shocking to believe that they had sculpting down to a level that was computer accurate, right? And the geometry of the eye sockets, of the cheekbones, in 3 dimensions is identical. So you have right side versus left side, both from straight on, both from a 45-degree angle, both from a 90-degree perpendicular angle. You have absolute precision on right and left matching together. Now, something was going on in these guys that was absolutely beyond where we are today. But because of the ego of man, we have people revising our history so that we're essentially prevented from ever being that smart again, because we can't go back and see where we were. Or we have to essentially reinvent it in the modern age, co-opted by corporations, whereby if you come up with some invention, the corporation has the right to usurp it out of your hands, right, and take your patent away from you. It's imperative in my mind that we have to get back to the point where we're willing to acknowledge that history is way more beautiful and intense, that we've had most of it wiped away from us. There's the whole talk of the Alexander's library being burned down and raided, and I think that my suspicion is that whoever did that, if that had really truly existed, ran away with all the stuff first and then burned the place down, and that way they get to covet the knowledge. But, major cities appear to be built on these power meridians that I talked about that Earth used to have or still has. So Paris and London are all built on these meridians. It looks to be that the Giza Plateau has the same exact properties that was built on these naturally electrical currents coming out of the earth. And again, it's nothing more intense than a plasma core, which is sort of what Tesla said the earth has, is a very electrical core. And it's just the break in the crust. That's all it is, man. And because the crust holds together for the most part, you just have seams, just like a tobacco leaf has, veins of its growth pattern. It's the same thing. It's just a stress line that gives way, right? So the interesting thing, before I close up here, because we're not going to go too long on this one, is that the Egyptian archaeological group that is run by the country has actually been in overdrive for the past 10, 20 years, trying to keep people from looking deep into certain areas of the Egyptian, at least architecture for sure. Now, when I got heavy into Egyptology, pretty much between about 1995 and I'd say 2001, there's a bunch of crazy magazines in the San Francisco area that were actually published in San Francisco that came out quarterly that had incredible information. And the second that these scientists would discover it, they'd publish a magazine. There was no one in the way of information being released. And the amount of underground passages that existed when I was a kid in normal, low-hanging fruit Egyptology, archaeology, was huge. I mean, there's all these caverns way down underneath the pyramids that go down for a very scary distance with water aqueducts down there and all kinds of cool stuff. But today, if you ask the question of where they are, they'll acknowledge that they exist, but they won't tell you where they are. They won't let anybody go down there and take a look. And so it's frustrating that it seems to be that the closer that science is starting to get to the point of figuring out these pyramids, that the Egyptian government is starting to sanction exploration in those areas. And I'll tell you what my hunch is that the Egyptian government tells the people, their nationalistic movement, that we are the people that built the pyramids. Now, if you study just a little bit of history of the Egyptians in terms of, and you look at the hieroglyphs, right, you have very dark, chocolate dark, very African-looking, the flatter nose, individuals seeming to be in charge way back during the inception. Just look at King Tut's bust. He's a very African-looking individual, right? And then you look at the narrower nose of Nefertiti and the occupants that are there today that are very light-skinned. And you start to realize, the race that's there, when you read just the above ground history about all the different factions that took over Egypt one by one, right? The Mesopotamians and the Romans and God knows who else rushed into the area and took the place over. You can't have the race that made the place hanging around. And so as a matter of national pride, I think as the more we drill down inside these artifacts and this architecture and the hieroglyphs, is the more that we actually bump into maybe the people that are there today had nothing to do with what's there, and they don't want to have that backfire on them to the point where someone might say, well, then we definitely as a human race have the right to look at it because you're stealing the land as well, right? You've been there for a really long time, but you're not the owners of these things. The previous race that's gone is, and therefore it opens it up for exploration by all of us. And so they're trying desperately to put it together. But there's this crazy, excited, weird guy, and I don't know his name, but you'll always see him every time you see the certified Cairo Museum curator or dude come up, and he's he must be a good liar for their intellect, but he's a horrible liar for us. But the amount of fake bullshit events that they have created, and I mean fucking orchestrated out of thin air, is off the chain. I remember in the late 90s, I think it's probably about 98 or so, there was this fake event, I forgot, it was like Fox or something like that, just the station on TV, was going to allow a guy in, literally a newscaster in to open a casket for the very first time, right? It was the most staged, ridiculous thing you've ever seen. There was no seals on anything. Everything came apart really easily. It's almost as if when in Hollywood, they try to fake an archaeological dig, and if any of you've ever dug up anything from the ground, the soil is very fixed when it's been there for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and you have to work to remove the soil. But anytime you have a fake Hollywood event in a movie or something like that, it's always like just light sand that's been poured over the object, and you just dust it off with your paintbrush, and all of a sudden this thing's just right there. Well, this is how bad it was. And at that point I realized, holy shit, there's like a total cover-up of what's going on in Egypt. And it's just, now they've locked down a lot of the rooms underneath the Sphinx. The Sphinx is a hollow object that actually has room inside of it, which used to have portal windows out of its body so you could see stars at a certain point. And that's what Graham Hancock reported in his book, said that when you roll back the stars to Orion being directly in front of the Sphinx, then the holes in the belly of this beast actually point to very specific stars in space. And again, you could arbitrarily pick stars and say those are important and create this story, but I think it's just fascinating that we're seeing a transformation in the history of mankind. And what I would like to do with this episode, which I probably should have said at the very beginning, is I want to have more people from just the layman source, but you guys might be geologists, you might be electricians, you might be physicists on the side, you might actually have the knowledge that would crack some of this stuff open. But if you haven't, get up there and search on like the Magic Tour, which is an incredible series that really digs deep into Egyptology, but just get obsessed with it if it's anything you're interested in. And let's see if we can have some of you guys go to the forefront of this battle and unravel stuff and put together dots between two cultures, right? And see if we can't dig some of this stuff out, because, we have technology that appears to exist in multiple places in the world. And I think that begs a lot of questions, and I didn't get into the fact that the Egyptians actually built temples to map the human body. They were very into right brain, left brain spirituality. They were very into, they dug into the human body like crazy. They completely understood most of the organs in the human body on a glandular spiritual level, not just in a mechanical functional level. There's a lot to be explored, and I just think that I know that folks out there have already done a lot of this stuff, but let's push the information down to kids so that they get sort of this idea that it's like, as you grow up, child, and you're discovering Egyptology, you need to understand that they're trying to lie to you, and your objective is to push through behind the curtain and find out what's really there. Because I think we have conclusive proof now that the leading Egyptologists right now have built their pedigrees on lying, and they simply do not want anyone to come in and expose the game. So let's expose the game, why don't we? But we'll call this part 1, because I know that there's a million things we could talk about with Egypt, and I just wanted to kind of spark your brain with some of the stuff that fascinates me the most. And I'm by no means a massive authority. I put a lot of effort into researching it, but again, that doesn't make me an authority. It just makes me sort of an interesting hack. But anyway, if you made it this far, thanks for listening. As always, go to mkulturaradio.com. I'll skip the bumper today. Everything is there. So just go and explore. Our traffic is way up. It's cool. If you like the channel, please subscribe. If you dig the video, please like it. And we just hope to see you in the next episodes. And again, if you have any ideas, please post below, and we'll do what we can to create a deep thoughts all about what you're interested in. All right, man. Learn the rules that rule you, and we'll see you in the next episode. Over and out.